I'm very pleased to be joined here today by 4 speakers. Unfortunately, Erin Foley was under the weather and was not able to join us, so she will be missed, and hopefully we can loop her back into conversation later on in the process. I'm just going to do a quick introduction of folks, and then we're going to go right into questions because I want to make sure we leave a few minutes at the end for the wrap-up. We are joined by Mariah Carey, Sabina Alam, Director of Publishing Ethics and Integrity. Now, I asked Sabina originally to be part of the session because I wanted to make sure, as a humanities person myself, that we did bring humanities and social science perspective into the mix. Only after she accepted did she tell me that she actually had 2 other parts of the program today. So I think she really wanted to do it. So we're definitely happy to have her on board. Next to Sabina is my friend, Simone Taylor. Simone is Publisher and Chief of Publishing Operations at the American Psychiatric Association. Very excited to hear the perspectives that she brings from that role, and as well as previous roles. And then next to Simone, we have Erin Wood. Erin is Head Product and Content Management for the American Psychological Association. As you may have noticed in some of the pictures, Erin was with us brainstorming in London. So thanks for joining us here today. And we have Andy Hurd. Andy is Senior Director and IT Business Partner at IEEE. So we had a number of questions that were prepared in our extensive planning calls prior to today. So many of them have been asked and answered already that you can see my scribbles as to the questions to go. So I hope that the speakers will forgive me a little bit if we deviate just a scooch from some of those, because I do want to kind of dip into some topic areas that maybe we haven't covered yet. I'm going to start with Simone. And I want to ask, in the area of social responsibility, as it's depicted on the playing board, and everyone's happy to weigh in. We'll just start with Simone for this one. The pandemic really made us focus on inequities at many levels, and I would really like to hear in your current role and in previous roles, how that equity issue connects into many of these broader trends that we see on the board this year.
Hi, everyone, and thanks for inviting me to participate. The pandemic did shine an unrelenting light on society's inequities in general. And I think because of that, inequities are one of the things we face as an industry and things we need to address. The theme has been touched on almost every topic over the past 2 days, open access, social responsibility, and in that space, particularly now in my particular role, one of the learnings from the pandemic was that mental health was very important and was likely to affect many of us. And one of the goals in my present role is to try and normalize mental health to the point that people are more comfortable talking about their illnesses. In our experience, we ran a survey a few years ago on workplace equity, and as an industry, about 80+% of people reported no mental illness. Now, that's one of the downsides, I think, of a self-reporting survey, and also a reflection of the fact that we aren't really used to or comfortable admitting that we're ill or that we need help. And hopefully, as we become more aware and therefore more tolerant of these issues, we may be able to talk more about them and be more open.
Thank you. The other speakers want to weigh in on this? You don't have to. I've got other questions. Everyone's tired. Okay, we're going to keep on moving, and then we do hope that you will have questions as well. So I want to go to Andy next, and kind of playing off of the social responsibility angle again. but kind of touching over into open research. One of the things we learned when we were trying to kind of divvy these areas up is it's really impossible. They ebb and flow one into the other, and you start to talk about one, and you move through two or three others. We did hear earlier in the conference from Dana Compton at ASCE about some work that they did on sustainable development goals and pulling together their content. I know, Andy, when we did the prep call for this session, you talked a little bit about the platform, at IEEE and how it connected into issues like climate change, and I'd love to hear more about that.
Great. IEEE has taken a very deliberate and I think permanent sort of structural approach to social causes in general, and with climate change being one, the first step in that move. So our current president is very passionate about it, and speaking at COP this year, but we're establishing a platform around climate change, and particularly the role. So IEEE is about engineers and technology, and the role that technology can play in mitigating the effects of climate change, so that we can have a net positive effect on the climate, and that being that a recognition that technology doesn't always, well, you can't mine for bitcoins to pay off your carbon debt. So there are downsides to technology, and we want to sort of focus on what the benefits to technology, and recognizing that it's a need. Mm-hmm. It's also a means to reach out to a younger audience for whom they're not just engineers or not just scientists studying in a silo. That these causes have real currency for that the early career researcher.
Now you mentioned, just to continue just briefly, an energy taxonomy that had been created, and I thought that was kind of a cool contribution. And I mean, me, I'm all about metadata and taxonomies and schemas. Could you just tell us a little bit about that, if it's not too far of a diversion from?
I'm not going to be able to speak intelligently, but let me sort of segue.
None of us can at this point.
I'll just segue into collaboration, because I think the whole discussion around SDG taxonomies makes a lot of sense for us not to create one that would replicate something that's already being done. Mm-hmm. There's no need to invent two wheels. So.
Great, thank you. Anyone want to talk a bit about just SDGs and?
Yeah, a little more on the social responsibility side,
yes.
And also as it plays into collaboration, and it's very clear that all of these things are very related, hence the way that the board game is set up. At the American Psychological Association, we have a particular focus on DEI. That has been the case for quite a long time, but it has become more and more the case over the past several years. There was a public apology for the APA's role in promoting inequity and exclusivity. And it really diffuses or infuses all of the work that we do at APA. And apologies, I know we have two APAs here, so that's a little confusing, but at least we don't have two Aarons now.
Yeah, we were going to have two Aarons. To do that again.
Yeah, and even to the extent of, we have books that are published, of course, that cover this area, children's books as well. In our journals program, also several years ago, was released a set of recommendations for journal editors and how they can increase DEI through journal processes and peer review and so on and so forth. I encourage everybody to go and check that. Just search on Google. Search specifically APA EDI Toolkit, and you'll find it. And then the continued collaboration is that those efforts around the EDI toolkit continue with SSP. They also continue with AAP, where there is a DEI roadmap for publishers being developed.
Great. Sabina, you want to add something?
Slightly sort of on a tangent, if I may. I mean, being Mariah, obviously. But I think when we talk about some of these trends that are up on, up on the list here, I look at quite a few of them as being absolutely interconnected. So, we're talking about social responsibility, but what also really jumps out to me is the collaboration and the open research. And if we're talking specifically about the humanities and social sciences, I think this is where we really need to make sure that we don't leave that discipline behind, because I think if you talk to humanities and social scientists about data sharing, you hear very different approaches to what they even view data to be. And then we also think about the open research and the collaboration aspect. One thing that we always have to deal with at Taylor and Francis and our social sciences journals is that the research ethics expectations and standards differ somewhat from what is quite considered standard in, for example, the medical field or the biomedical field. So we have to be really careful when we're talking about research integrity and research ethics expectations to make sure that we're not only talking about the hard sciences all the time, and that we're also bringing in the nuances around the humanities and social sciences, because otherwise we'll go off in different directions. And I know this is an STM meeting, but that's one of my main pleas, that when we're looking at all of these sections, to really think about how those disciplines also work.
Yeah, and you mentioned when we were planning for this, something that I hadn't really thought about, which is a lot of the work, I mean, it should have thought about it, a lot of the work in the humanities and social sciences may take place over an enormous amount of time, and standards could change, and then there are some judgment calls around informed consent. And
yeah, I think the informed consent aspect is a huge issue. If you think about long-term ethnographic studies, do you spill over into covert research? And also about the research participants, what are their rights and responsibilities? Do they know that they are research participants? And there was a really amazing plenary session at UKSG a couple of weeks ago by a scholar who works with the indigenous communities, and she made a really powerful point about how indigenous knowledge for years and years has almost been colonialized, because you have researchers from one part of the world going and learning from indigenous communities things that they have only ever expected to relay in oral format, and not really knowing that it's being taken and published in written format, and actually the sensitivities around that. When they were talking to the researchers about their indigenous knowledge, did they know that this was going to be disseminated in that way? And therefore we have a responsibility as the publishing community to make sure that we're asking the right questions, not just to the researchers, but to the institutions as well, because often what they say is we don't have that guidance here, but that's not expected of us. So that's for me one of the main things when we talk about these trends, is to keep all of those nuances in mind.
And it's a great tie-in to the session yesterday where we heard from Andrew and Claudia about some of the local data mandates and publication mandates for First Nations and Indigenous people. So thanks for raising that issue. I want to go back to Aaron just for a second. We've heard a lot of talk about integrity and AI, but one of the things that you brought up during the planning was around the potential pitfalls for AI, specifically in the education space. I wonder if you could just talk a little bit about that, because that was new to me.
Yeah, so I think I'll talk about it first as a sort of the similarities and how there's a common aspect with higher education and with research and scholarly publishing. If you think of how publishing looks at, for example, generative AI and its role in, not so much in the scientific process, but in the writing of a manuscript, it's fairly universally agreed at this point that the tool cannot be an author, because it can't be responsible for the work or for the science. If you look at it from the education perspective, there's a similar problem with the tools being used for assignments and for papers. But there, the issue is about the learning integrity, not the research integrity. Similarly, the AI tool cannot be responsible for the learning. So you have a sort of continuum here of responsibility for the learning of the science and then responsibility for the science. But to paint a nice dystopian, well, nice dystopian is probably not the right way of combining it, but just for fun to have a dystopian vision. So we talk about paper mills from the publishing perspective and the addition of generative AI tools, which is going to make the problem so much harder and difficult. You can think of a predatory education side of this as well, where you have courses, online programs, degrees being spun up, and even putting a particular focus on those, ideological, nationalistic, whatever it happens to be. It's not that far-fetched to consider a dystopian future wherein we have the same kind of echo chambers in education as we have in social media.
Would anyone else like to comment on?
Just a comment on AI in general. I think it's been mentioned here that, yes, it's troublesome, problematic, but it also can be an opportunity for us. Now, I think we take a step back and there's a wider issue in how AI is programmed and who does the programming and what we use to inform the artificial intelligence. I have two nephews, brothers, 13 months apart. The younger one used his Apple iPhone facial recognition system to lock his phone, only to find to his consternation that his older brother could open the phone with his own photograph. So with all the consternation of a 10-year-old, it was, he hacked my phone. But, and which was quite funny, but there's a serious side to this in terms of mistaken identity. And you don't have to think too far to see how it could be really life-threatening for people of certain ethnicities. So I think as we try to deal with AI and cope with it, one of the fundamental things we have to address is, and that applies to almost everything in our industry, which is far from demographically representative of the wider population. We just need to make sure that we put the right systems in place to build the artificial intelligence tools in the first place.
And Sabina, you touched on digital identity in the prior session, but it was something we talked about extensively getting ready for this session. Could you just talk a little bit more about the various ways that's being emphasized within Taylor and Francis?
Do you mean digital identity of authors?
Yes.
Yes. Well, I mean, I think we've heard a lot over the last 2 days. We have an expert right here in front of us who's told us a lot about that. But I think one of the key things that we need to be able to do, and we're not currently doing, I think not well enough, is the being able to attach the activities, the positive outputs. So I don't want to talk about fraud anymore. So I think the positive outputs of researchers with their with the single digital identity, whether that's ORCID or something else. So we've talked so much about, do you get rewarded to do review? Do you what about editors, the amount of work that editors put in, and then also as authors or reviewers and co-authors. I think we didn't touch upon that the last few days about author contributions. We're still so traditional in terms of author order, author number one or last order. What about the ones in the middle? And are there ways that digital identifiers can also capture their key contributions in a way that goes back up to their digital identity, so we can move away from this hierarchy in authorship? And that's something I think that we need to think about a bit more. I have no idea how to do it, but that's one of the things.
Anyone want to add to that?
So we've talked a lot about, the digital identity is really important also in terms of maybe in the same vein of disambiguating actors in their different roles. So if you're an author, an editor, or a reviewer, or in our case, a member of a society in IEEE, knowing the full composite view of who you are gives us a sense of what are the other needs and interests that, that can help, nurture that relationship that we have with folks. And that's the other side, the other side of AI is helping to disambiguate. It's not generative AI, but and then on the research integrity side, just using that information, which is really necessary in bridging across author, reviewer, and editor, is looking at yourself in the mirror and seeing and looking for real anomalies in the editorial process to root out any activity there that is 2 or 3 standard deviations from the norm, and figure out what's going on. So,
yeah. Aaron?
I mean, the only thing that I would add is that it seems as though there's an institutional aspect to the identity that we are perhaps understating in how we are working with authors and also consumers of information. Examples of where you look at both is sort of a dual identity, understanding both the individual's identity and their institutional affiliation, and as part of that, changing with the role. But we tend to do it one way or the other, right? So when we look at access, people coming into consumer content, we think of it as an institution. We don't really do much on the individual side, unless it's, SAML or something like that. And then on the author side and the submission, we really think of the individual only. And both are responsible in some way for all of the actions, either as consumers or as research, support, and output.
Thank you to our speakers and to STM for giving us the opportunity to weigh in on the trends infographic this year.